Hello once again to another installment of Some Idiot Reads. I'm Cy, I'm some idiot, and I'm going to be reading not at the belly up to my deadline for once in the last several weeks. In spite of the fact, just everything in the world. So, yay. Going to be continuing today with Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. We are at chapter 10 out of 12. Woo! You know, when I started this thing, too, with Project 2025 for the first few of them until it just became way too much. And then I started on this one. It's been a lot that's changed in the world since then. I'm not really going to comment any further on it. I just kind of want to get to the reading and get this addressed, get this ready to go, and get it to your ear holes. Okay. Anyway, let's get this going. Click over here. Good deal. Chapter 10. The Tragedy of Woman's Emancipation. I begin with an admission. Regardless of all political and economic theories, treating of the fundamental differences between various groups within the human race, regardless of class and race distinctions, regardless of all artificial boundary lines between women's rights and man's rights, I hold that there is a point where these differentiations may meet and grow into a perfect whole. With this, I do not mean to propose a peace treaty. The general social antagonism which has taken hold of our entire public life today, brought about through the force of opposing and contradictory interests, will crumble to pieces when the reorganization of our social life, based upon the principles of economic justice, shall have become a reality. Peace or harmony between the sexes and individuals does not necessarily depend on a superficial equalization of human beings, nor does it call for the elimination of individual traits and peculiarities. The problem that confronts us today, and which the nearest future is to solve, is how to be one's self and yet in oneness with others, to feel deeply with all human beings and still retain one's own characteristic qualities. It seems to me to be the basis upon which the mass and the individual, the true democrat and the true individuality, man and woman, can meet without antagonism and opposition. The motto should not be forgive one another, rather, understand one another. The oft-quoted sentence of Madame de Staël, quote, "To understand everything means to forgive everything," end quote, has never particularly appealed to me. It has the odor of the confessional. To forgive one's fellow being conveys the idea of pharisaical superiority. Or pharisaical? Pharisaical? I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. To understand one's fellow being suffices. The admission partly represents the fundamental aspect of my views on the emancipation of woman and its effect upon the entire sex. Emancipation should make it possible for woman to be human in the truest sense. Everything within her that craves assertion and activity should reach its fullest expression. All artificial barriers should be broken, and the road towards greater freedom cleared of every trace of centuries of submission and slavery. This was the original aim of the movement for women's emancipation. But the results so far have isolated woman and robbed her of the fountain springs of that happiness which is so essential to her. Merely external emancipation has made of the modern woman an artificial being who reminds one of the products of French arboriculture, with its arabesque trees and shrubs, pyramids, wheels, and wreaths, except the forms which should be reached by the expression of her own inner qualities. That's right, anything except the forms which would be reached by the expression of her own inner qualities. Such artificially grown plants of the female sex are to be found in large numbers, especially in the so-called intellectual sphere of our life. Liberty and equality for woman. What hopes and aspirations these words awakened when they were first uttered by some of the noblest and bravest souls of those days. The sun, in all its light and glory, was to rise upon a new world. In this world, woman was to be free to direct her own destiny, an aim certainly worthy of great enthusiasm, courage, perseverance, and ceaseless effort of the tremendous host of pioneer men and women who staked everything against a world of prejudice and ignorance. My hopes also move toward that goal, but I hold that the emancipation of woman, as interpreted and practically applied today, has failed to reach that great end. Now, woman is confronted with the necessity of emancipating herself from emancipation if she really desires to be free. This may sound paradoxical, but it is, nevertheless, only too true. What has she achieved through her emancipation? Equal suffrage in a few states. Has that purified our political life, as many well-meaning advocates predicted? Certainly not. Incidentally, it is really time that persons with plain, sound judgment should cease to talk about corruption in politics in a boarding school tone. Corruption of politics has nothing to do with morals or the laxity of morals of various political personalities. Its cause is altogether a material one. Politics is the reflex of the business and industrial world, the mottos of which are, "To take is more blessed than to give. Buy cheap and sell dear. One soiled hand washes the other." There is no hope even that woman, with her right to vote, will ever purify politics. Emancipation has brought woman economic equality with man. That is, she can choose her own profession and trade, but as her past and present physical training has not equipped her with the necessary strength to compete with man, she's often compelled to exhaust all her energy, use up her vitality, and strain every nerve in order to reach the market value. Very few ever succeed, for it is a fact that women teachers, doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers are neither met with the same confidence as their male colleagues, nor receive equal remuneration. And those that do reach that enticing equality generally do so at the expense of their physical and psychical well-being. As to the great mass of working girls and women, how much independence is gained if the narrowness and lack of freedom of the home is exchanged for the narrowness and lack of freedom for the factory, sweatshop, department store, or office? In addition, is the burden which is laid on many women looking after a home sweet home, cold, dreary, disorderly, uninviting, after a hard day's work. Glorious independence. No wonder that hundreds of girls are so willing to accept the first offer of marriage, sick and tired of their quote-unquote independence behind the counter, at the sewing or typewriting machine. They're just as ready to marry as girls of the middle class who long to throw off the yoke of parental supremacy. A so-called independence, which leads only to earning the merest subsistence, is not so enticing, not so ideal, that one would expect woman to sacrifice everything for it. Our highly praised independence is, after all, but a slow process of dulling and stifling woman's nature, her love instinct, and her mother instinct. Nevertheless, the position of the working girl is a far more natural and human than that of her seemingly more fortunate sister in the more cultured professional walks of life, teachers, physicians, lawyers, engineers, etc., who have to make a dignified, proper appearance, while the inner life is growing empty and dead. The narrowness of the existing conception of woman's independence and emancipation, the dread of love for a man who is not her social equal, the fear that love will rob her of her freedom and independence, the horror that love, or the joy of motherhood, will only hinder her in the full exercise of her profession, all these together make of the emancipated modern woman a compulsory vestal before whom life, with its great clarifying sorrows and its deep entrancing joys, rolls on without gripping her soul. Emancipation, as understood by the majority of its adherents and exponents, is of too narrow a scope to permit the boundless love and ecstasy contained in the deep emotion of the true woman, sweetheart, mother, in freedom. The tragedy of self-supporting or economically free woman does not lie in too many, but in too few experiences. True, she surpasses her sister of past generations in knowledge of the world and human nature. It is just because of this that she feels deeply the lack of life's essence, which alone can enrich the soul, and without which the majority of women have become mere professional automatons. That such a state of affairs was bound to come was foreseen by those who realized that, in the domain of ethics, there still remained many decaying ruins of the time of the undisputed superiority of man, ruins that are still considered useful. And, what is more important, a goodly number of the emancipated are unable to get along without them. Every movement that aims at the destruction of existing institutions and the replacement thereof with something more advanced, more perfect, has followers who, in theory, stand for the most radical ideas, but who, nevertheless, in their everyday practice, are like the average Philistine, feigning respectability and clamoring for the good opinion of their opponents. There are, for example, socialists and even anarchists who stand for the idea that property is robbery, yet who will grow indignant if anyone owe them the value of a half-dozen pins. The same Philistine can be found in the movement for women's emancipation. Yellow journalists and milk and water litterateurs have painted pictures of the emancipated woman that make the hair of the good citizen and his dull companion stand straight up on end. Every member of the women's rights movement was pictured as a George Sand in her absolute disregard of morality. Nothing was sacred to her. She had no respect for the ideal relation between man and woman. In short, emancipation stood only for a reckless life of lust and sin. Enchantment! An enchantment, says my phone. Regardless of society, religion, and morality, the exponents of women's rights were highly indignant at such misrepresentation, and, lacking humor, they exerted all their energy to prove that they were not all as bad as they were painted, but the very reverse. Of course, as long as woman was the slave of man, she could not be good and pure. But now that she was free and independent, she would prove how good she could be, and that her influence would have a purifying effect on all institutions in society. True, the movement for women's rights has broken many old fetters, but it has also forged new ones. The great movement of true emancipation has not met with a great race of women who could look liberty in the face. Their narrow, puritanical vision banished man as a disturber and doubtful character out of their emotional life. Man was not to be tolerated at any price, except perhaps as the father of a child, since a child could not very well come to life without a father. Fortunately, the most rigid Puritans never will be strong enough to kill the innate craving for motherhood. But woman's freedom is closely allied with man's freedom, and many of my so-called emancipated sisters seem to overlook the fact that a child born in freedom needs the love and devotion of each human being about him, man as well as woman. Unfortunately, this narrow conception of human relations that has brought about a great tragedy in the lives of modern man and woman. About 15 years ago appeared a work from the pen of the brilliant Norwegian Laura Marholm called Woman, a character study. She was one of the first to call attention to the emptiness and narrowness of the existing conception of woman's emancipation and its tragic effect upon the inner life of woman. In her work, Laura Marholm speaks of the fate of several gifted women of international fame, the genius of Eleonora Duse, the great mathematician and writer Sonia Kovalevskaya, the artist and poet nature of Marie Bashkirtseff, who died so young. Through each description of the lives of these women of such extraordinary mentality runs a marked trail of unsatisfied craving for a full, rounded, complete, and beautiful life, and the unrest and loneliness resulting from the lack of it. Through these masterly psychological sketches, one cannot help but see that the higher the mental development of woman, the less possible it is for her to meet a congenial mate who will see in her not only sex, but also the human being, the friend, the comrade, and strong individuality, who cannot and ought not lose a single trait of her character. The average man, with his self-sufficiency, his ridiculously superior airs of patronage towards the female sex, is an impossibility for woman as depicted in the character study by Laura Morrow. Equally impossible for her is the man who can see in her nothing more than her mentality and her genius, and who fails to awaken her woman nature. A rich intellect and a fine soul are usually considered necessary attributes of a deep and beautiful personality. In the case of the modern woman, these attributes serve as a hindrance to the complete assertion of her being. For over 100 years, the old form of marriage, based on the Bible, till death doth part, has been denounced as an institution that stands for the sovereignty of man over woman, of her complete submission to his whims and commands, and absolute dependence on his name and support. Time and again, it has been conclusively proved that the old matrimonial relation restricted woman to the function of man's servant and the bearer of his children. And yet we find many emancipated women who prefer marriage, with all its deficiencies, to the narrowness of an unmarried life, narrow and unendurable because of the chains of moral and social prejudice that cramp and bind her nature. The explanation of such inconsistency on the part of many advanced women is to be found in the fact that they never truly understood the meaning of emancipation. They thought that all that was needed was independence from external tyrannies. The internal tyrants, far more harmful to life and growth, ethical and social conventions, were left to take care of themselves, and they have taken care of themselves. They seem to get along as beautifully in the heads and hearts of the most active exponents of woman's emancipation as in the heads and hearts of our grandmothers. These internal tyrants, whether they be in the form of public opinion, or what will mother say, or brother, father, aunt, or relative of any sort, what will Miss Grundy, Mr. Comstock, the employer, the Board of Education say? All these busybodies, moral detectives, jailers of the human spirit, what will they say? Until woman has learned to defy them all, to stand firmly on her own ground, and to insist upon her own unrestricted freedom, to listen to the voice of her nature, whether it call for life's greatest treasure, love for a man, or her most glorious privilege, the right to give birth to a child, she cannot call herself emancipated. How many emancipated women are brave enough to acknowledge that the voice of love is calling, wildly beating against their breasts, demanding to be heard, to be satisfied? The French writer Jean Raybrac, in one of his novels, New Beauty, attempts to picture the ideal, beautiful, emancipated woman. The ideal is embodied in a young girl, a physician. She talks cleverly and wisely of how to feed infants. She is kind, and administers medicines free to the poor mothers. She converses with a young man of her acquaintance about the sanitary conditions of the future, and how various bacilli and germs shall be exterminated by the use of stone walls and floors, and by doing away with rugs and hangings. She is, of course, very plainly and practically dressed, mostly in black. The young man, who, at their first meeting, was overawed by the wisdom of his emancipated friend, gradually learns to understand her, and recognizes one fine day that he loves her. They are young, and she is kind and beautiful, and, though always in rigid attire, her appearance is softened by a spotlessly clean white collar and cuffs. One would expect that he would tell her of his love, but he is not one to commit to romantic absurdities. Poetry and the enthusiasm of love cover their blushing faces before the pure beauty of the lady. He silences the voice of his nature and remains correct. She, too, is always exact, always rational, always well behaved. I fear if they had formed a union, the young man would have risked freezing to death. I must confess, I can see nothing beautiful in his new beauty, who is as cold as the stone walls and floors she dreams of. Rather, I would have the love songs of romantic ages. Rather Don Juan and Madame Venus. Rather an elopement by ladder and rope on a moonlit night, followed by the father's curse, the mother's moans, and the moral comments of neighbors, than the correctness and propriety measured by yardsticks. If love does not know how to give and take without restrictions, it's not love, but a transaction that never fails to lay stress on a plus and minus. The greatest shortcoming of the emancipation of the present day lies in its artificial stiffness and its narrow respectabilities, which produce an emptiness in woman's soul that will not let her drink from the fountain of life. I once remarked that there seemed to be a deeper relationship between the old-fashioned mother and hostess, ever on the alert for the happiness of her little ones and the comfort of those she loved, and the truly new woman than between the latter and her average emancipated sister. The disciples of emancipation, pure and simple, declared me a heathen, fit only for the stake. Their blind zeal did not let them see that my comparison between the old and the new was merely to prove that a goodly number of our grandmothers had more blood in their veins, far more humor and wit, and certainly a greater amount of naturalness, kind-heartedness, and simplicity than the majority of our emancipated professional women who fill the colleges, halls of learning, and various offices. This does not mean a wish to return to the past, nor does it condemn women to her old sphere, the kitchen and the nursery. Salvation lies in an energetic march onward towards a brighter and clearer future. We are in need of unhampered growth out of old traditions and habits. The movement for woman's emancipation has so far made but the first step in that direction. It is to be hoped that it will gather strength to make another. The right to vote, or equal civil rights, may be good demands, but true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in the courts. It begins in woman's soul. History tells us that every oppressed class gained true liberation from its masters through its own efforts. It is necessary that woman learn this lesson, that she realize her freedom will reach as far as her power to achieve her freedom reaches. It is, therefore, far more important for her to begin with her inner regeneration, to cut loose from the weight of prejudices, traditions, and customs. The demand for equal rights in every vocation of life is just and fair, but after all, the most vital right is the right to love and be loved. Indeed, if partial emancipation is to become a complete and true emancipation of woman, it will have to do away with the ridiculous notion that to be loved, to be sweetheart and mother, is synonymous with being slave or subordinate. It will have to do away with the absurd notion of the dualism of the sexes, or that man and women represent two antagonistic worlds. Pettiness separates. Breadth unites. Let us be broad and big. Let us not overlook vital things because of the bulk of trifles confronting us. A true conception of the relation of the sexes will not admit of conqueror and defeated, or conqueror and conquered. It knows of but one great thing, to give of oneself boundlessly in order to find oneself richer, deeper, and better. That alone can fill the emptiness and transform the tragedy of woman's emancipation into joy, limitless joy. And there is that. I honestly, I lament that this is not this particular aspect of Goldman's essays is not my area of deep amount of thought. But I think I follow what she's saying here, and I really hesitate to say, like, I think she's right, because I don't know. I don't know about anyone else. I feel the I still feel that hesitation because, hey, I'm a dude. I have privilege that women, even today, still don't fucking have. Can I really sit and make a positive commentary like, that sounds right, when it's not something I personally deal with? If you've made it this far, please feel free to leave a comment. I would love to see some people's thoughts on this. I mean, granted, it is an older text. Like, Jesus, it's getting closer to 100 years ago now. Closer? It might be 100. I forget the year this was. I said it early on. But, this is an old text, and things have changed. But some things also haven't. I mean, right here, where was it? What caught my attention here, not in terms of the philosophy of the sexes or anything like that. Where was it? Right here. I'm going to do a slight word change on this because I feel it rings true for today's environment. History tells us that every oppressed class gained true liberation from its masters through its own efforts. It is necessary that the people learn that lesson, that they realize their freedom will reach as far as their power to achieve their freedom will reach. The United States today is on a fast track towards becoming an authoritarian state. We're going to shit. And there are plenty of people far more well-versed and learned than myself saying the same freaking thing. One of the biggest issues that I see personally, for what it's worth from some idiot here, one of the biggest issues that I see facing most of the American people today is we are a victim of our own sedentariness. Myself included to a degree. For all, I'll sit down and I will tell people, I engaged in a fair amount of protest when I was younger. I've not done that in a significant period. I think the only protest I even went to in relatively recent history was during the BLM protests a few years ago. And even then, that was not because I had a particular drive to go, though I did. I specifically personally held off on doing that because I'm not the kind of person you want to have at that protest. If I'm the kind of person that you need at that protest is not going right. But a friend of mine did want to go and engage in solidarity with the individuals there, but they'd never been to a protest, so they asked me to kind of go along with and help them because our local PD was not making a good showing of things. But like outside of that, I think the last protest I went to was 20 years ago. A long time ago. So I definitely am also just as guilty of some degree of sedentariness, but I think we as a people, we need to figure out when and how are we going to say enough is enough and get up and get moving. Because honestly, I see a lot of performative actions just being done these days. Actions that on the face of it seem right, but are not themselves. There's no substance underneath. It's like the difference between giving $1,000 because it is the thing to do. Not that any of us have $1,000. I'm trying to reach an extreme. Bear with me. But it's like the difference between giving $1,000 to a charity because it's the expectation to do versus giving $1,000 to a charity because you genuinely believe in that. The action is the same, but for one of the individuals, it's purely performative. And I see a lot of performativism going on these days. Well-intentioned, and maybe people don't realize that's what they're doing, and probably would be upset to have it insinuated that their acts of resistance are fundamentally performative. But man, we got to break through on something. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this recording here because dinner just showed up and I am hungry. And hey, good deal for getting a recording done not the day before. Legitimately, I hope all of you are doing well. Any of you that made it through to the end of the video, thank you so very much. Please give it a like, toss in a comment. I'd love to hear some thoughts on things, just general philosophy or whatever. Tell me you think my voice sucks. I really don't care. I mean, I do. It hurts a little bit, but you know what? Hey, engage with it. Go for it. I don't know. And next week we will have probably another one of the dispatches from Appalachia. So look forward to that. And only a couple more left here in Anarchism and Other Essays, and then we will move on to another text. TBD. All right. I'm going to get my dinner. You all take care. Love you all.